I have a story to tell, but it could potentially get me into some trouble, so I'm going to leave out any clearly identifying details in the hopes it stays anonymous enough there won't be any blowback. What I will say, though, is this. Many years ago, I worked as a detective for the state police, in a state where there are several Native American reservations. Often we would get called to assist the reservation police on cases that were too complicated for them to solve with their limited resources. As with most things on the reservation, their police forces are often underfunded and with limited staff. This particular case was what appeared to be a homicide. A guy from the reservation, one that none of the neighbors particularly liked, might I add, was found beaten to death out in the middle of an otherwise empty field. He was wearing sweats and a t-shirt, no shoes, and looked like he'd been pulled right off the couch except for the fact that the bottoms of his feet were so worn out. They surmised that he'd been running for a long time before whatever happened out there happened. That wasn't the only strange thing about this case, though. It had rained earlier in the day, and we were able to find his footprints in the mud several places leading from his house to the open area where his body was found. The back door of his house was wide open when we got there, and his barefooted tracks were in the mud right from the start. It was now obvious that he had not been pulled off the couch. From his stride, it looked like he was chased off the couch. However, there was only one human set of footprints. I repeat, only one human set of tracks. You got that, right? Because that's super important. At several points along the way, we also found what appeared to be large deer tracks running alongside his footprints. When I say large deer tracks, I don't mean large like an elk. I mean large like a human-sized foot, but hooved like a deer. These tracks were also found in his front yard. In fact, right by the living room window, which had been shattered from the outside. The general consensus among most of the investigators was that someone had come to settle a score with him. It was his brother who told me there was another explanation, but once you hear it, you'll understand why I never bothered to present it to my coworkers as a possibility. It's absolutely crazy sounding, but after talking at length with the brother, my personal belief is that it's true. You see, the deceased guy had been poaching for as long as he'd been old enough, and in these parts, that's pretty young. He didn't have a whole lot of respect for wildlife or game laws and used some pretty unethical hunting practices, like baiting and spotlighting deer while out on his hunts. He told his brother that one night he was out trying to bait a buck when he came face to face with a Wendigo, but somehow managed to escape. The problem with escaping a Wendigo, though, is that according to folklore, you never really do. Once a Wendigo has set its sights on you, it doesn't give up. This guy had about made himself crazy over the last few months, telling his brother about how this Wendigo was following him around. He'd quit his job over it when the thing kept showing up at work. He'd even stopped leaving the house for the most part, and had been pretty close to living as a hermit at the time he was killed. The brother's thoughts were that the Wendigo got tired of waiting for the guy to come out of his house and took matters into its own hands, breaking out the front windows and running the guy out the back door. Now I know what you're thinking. The guy was just a crazy kook who was afraid of a Wendigo. So couldn't it have just been someone dressed as a Wendigo who came around trying to prank him? The proof for me is in what was found in the broken glass of that broken window. Not only was there blood and shorter, deer-looking hair all caught up in the glass, but at one place in the shattered remains of the glass, there was a thin strip of soft, slightly furry and satiny skin, the exact kind you'd pull of a deer's antlers. So my summary of this entire situation is that this guy messed around poaching animals under unfair and horrifying circumstances, and in the end, his actions caught up to him. Now you'll remember that I never told this to my coworkers, but I have shared it with some select friends and family, and you know what? They all said that he got exactly what he deserved in return. First, I have to say your channel is awesome. My friends and I like to watch shows about aliens, ghosts, Bigfoot, and all those kinds of things. We even have these little competitions where we find and share with each other the best paranormal stories. Seems like every time I win, I used a story I heard from your channel. I know they would love your videos, but I don't want to give away my source. So I'll keep watching you in secret, taking notes every step of the way. I've personally never seen a ghost or anything like that, but one time I saw an animal that freaked me out. Looking back, this is probably what initially sparked my obsession with all things paranormal. I've told this story to a lot of people, and I've had a few say that I was lying and just making this up. It just goes to show you that people's ignorance knows no bounds. Thanks for providing an ever-growing forum where people can share their experiences and gather insight instead of receiving judgment. You and all your hard work mean a lot to me. My dad owns about 50 acres of land, and over the years, we've made a four-wheeler trail that's nothing short of epic. It's got everything: steep inclines, long winding declines, a couple of ramps where you can get some serious air, a mud pit, an untamed wilderness as far as the eye can see. I love going there after to clear my head. There's nobody else around, and there is something about being alone in nature that calms and centers me. Many years ago, I was four-wheeling on the trail late at night when I smelt something awful. We had some problems with people dumping trash on our property a couple of times, so I figured this was what I was dealing with. I went off the trail and headed towards the source of the smell. This was a rancid smell, enough to gag a maggot. My eyes started tearing up the closer I got to it. My four-wheeler's headlights revealed a large animal feasting on a smaller animal up ahead, and realized that this might be the source of the smell. If one dead animal smelt this bad, I had to figure out what it was. As I got closer to the creature, I realized it was huge and looked like nothing I'd ever seen before in my life. It was the size of a bear with spikes on its back. It looked like a giant wolf without any hair. Its eyes were gigantic and awful. The creature looked right at me, dropped the carcass, and started snarling at me. The sounds this beast made were awful. It sounded like a rabid dog's growl, but it was human-like and sounded demonic. It made low bellowing sounds and then high-pitched pained groans. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but I've never heard an animal sound anything like that. I was terrified and knew I needed to get the hell out of there fast. I gassed it out of there as fast as that four-wheeler would take me. As I made my way back to the trail, I heard those demonic grunts behind me. I thought I was going to die, and I tried to swerve the four-wheeler in an unpredictable pattern as head back to the house. Finally, I didn't hear the beast anymore, and I made it safely back inside the house. I told my dad what had happened, and he headed out into the woods. We searched all over but couldn't find the creature. When we got to the location where I first saw the beast, the small animal carcass was still there, but it was nowhere to be found. What was strange was that the little animal was still mostly intact, despite the size of the demonic naked wolf that feasted on it. Dad checked all the trail cams, but none of them caught the creature on camera. He told me to be careful and keep an eye out for it. I began researching what I had seen in the woods, and the only thing that was coming up at first was Bigfoot. But then I learned about a creature called the chupacabra. This creature was described as 5 to 6 feet tall and wolf-like in appearance. One person said that it has spikes on its back, and it doesn't have any hair, but I don't know. Anyway, chupa means sucker, and cabra means goat in Spanish. It was called goat sucker because it was often found sucking all the blood out of animals such as goats. Could this thing in the woods have sucked all this poor animal's blood out? I'm not saying with 100% certainty that the creature that I saw was a chupacabra, but out of all the animals that I've researched, this is the only one I've found that matches what I saw. I hope I never see it again, but I've looked for it a lot over the years. My dad and I put up more trail cams, and we've put up motion lights all along the trail to try to get some evidence of the creature. So far, however, we've only captured deer, dogs, turkeys, etc. But having motion lights so you can ride the trail at night is awesome, so maybe I should be thanking the beast. Thanks for reading my story, and I wish you continued success in your channel. The stories that I hear you tell are amazing, and it makes me feel validated that so many other people have these experiences. There is something innate in us as humans that wants to believe there is more to life than life itself. So perhaps this sometimes leads to a lot of people thinking their normal experiences are paranormal sometimes. But with all the paranormal experiences people claim to have, it's impossible that all of them aren't true. I'm a believer, and I know I'm not the only one out there. Hey there, I'm a big fan of your channel, and I have a story I feel like you'd definitely be interested in. It's my favorite to tell at campfires and sleepovers and things, but even though it sounds like any old dumb ghost story, it's 100% true. It really happened, even if no one I tell it to think so. When I was little, my family and I moved around quite a bit. My dad worked in construction, so we kind of adjusted based on whatever job site he was assigned to at the time. When this story took place, I was around 11, young but definitely cognizant, you know? I knew what was normal and what wasn't. We moved into this little apartment building a little ways outside of Chicago, and if nothing else, the place was definitely run down. I didn't mind though, because I was a kid, but it was annoying to hear my folks arguing all the time. Since I was an only child, I had to get sort of creative when it came time to play. I came up with these intricate stories with my dolls, and found this little crawl space attached to my room to play in when I wanted to feel hidden. That's where I created my imaginary world. So about that crawl space, as I said, I kept a lot of my stuff in there, and I usually left the door open. It would get stuck sometimes, and Lord knows I didn't want to accidentally trap myself in that small, tight space. After we lived there for a few weeks, I began to vaguely notice that things in my room would be out of place. My dolls would be in totally different spots. My bed would be unmade even if I was sure I made it. My books would be open even if I hadn't touched them in a while. At the time, I assumed that it was due to my parents doing stuff, like my mom coming in to clean things up and moving all my stuff around in the process. But the thing was, my parents started commenting about it too. Plus, why would they open book and undo my made bed? There was this one day, for instance, when my dad had to stay at work a little later than usual, and I was home alone for a few hours after school. This happened every once in a while and wasn't really a bother to me. I wasn't scared to be alone or anything, well, not at first. So that day, like normal, I hung out in my room, playing with my stuff. Next thing I knew, my dad comes home screaming at me to come downstairs. Turns out, I kid you not, our dishwasher was open, and there were plates, cups, utensils everywhere. At least half the load was thrown all around the kitchen, all scattered. My dad, he thought I did it. In fact, he was sure it was me, and he was pissed. Obviously, though, I wouldn't have done that, but I helped him clean it up. We had to spend nearly the entire rest of the night picking up pieces of broken glass from the floor. I felt awful. Anyway, a few days after this happened, stuff gets even weirder somehow. My mom wakes up with these massive bruises on her arms, like some serious, scary movie activity. My dad is freaking out because not only is she all bruised up, but more and more random objects around the house start going missing, including his work laptop. So then this one day, my dad kind of has a freak out. I remember sitting in my room and just minding my own business when all of a sudden my dad swung open the door and just barged in. He didn't say anything to me, or yell really, but he was tearing my room apart. Eventually, I hurtfully realized that it was because he seriously thought I had stolen some stuff and hid it in my room. He keeps throwing stuff all around my room, looking for his missing stuff, and then the crawl space kind of catches his eye. That is when the freakiest thing happened. As soon as my dad starts to walk towards the crawl space to check out what's inside, the door slams open. Let me be clear, there is no draft in my room. I had some tiny windows that I always kept shut because there weren't screens and bugs freak me out. So in no way was there any kind of natural rhyme or reason for why my door randomly snapped closed the way it did. This didn't just scare the crap out of me either. My dad screamed too. so we both just kind of sat there in silence for a second, absorbing the situation. Then, my dad decides enough is enough. He walks over to the crawlspace door and starts tugging at it anyway. Watching this all happen from my bed, it was interesting, like I had a bird's eye view of what was happening. That's how I saw what was about to happen next, without even trying. I watch him tugging at the door. Yeah, but then my bookshelf that's faced towards him and the crawl space starts going crazy. It was shaking like there was an earthquake or something. A book flies off. Just one. And that's enough to make me scream bloody murder. My dad, luckily quick, noticed me yelling and noticed the bookshelf in enough time to jump the hell out of the way. Good thing he did too, since directly afterwards all of the contents of the shelves began to fall. So my dad reassesses the situation. It was clearly obvious that I didn't do that, and also obvious that what happened wasn't natural. He later apologized pretty profusely about the whole thing without ever being specific as to what he meant. "I'm sorry I was acting strange," he said, "and I didn't mean to blame you for what was going on," type of stuff. He never directly used the word ghost, but they say kids sense these things. I was a kid, and I definitely sensed something wasn't right, and it was making my dad nervous too. We ended up moving out of that place about a month after the bookshelf incident. For that last month, though, things kept being strange, but nothing as violently odd as the bookcase incident. Since then, I haven't felt or seen anything like it, so I wonder what you all make of the whole ordeal. Please let me know. You ever gone cave diving? There's a word for it. I don't remember. Anyway, I used to go. Not professionally, mind you. Where I grew up, we didn't do much of anything professionally. You find strange things to fill your time as a kid in Arizona. The way things used to be, you were out of the house for as long as the sun was burning in the sky. I guess it was only a matter of time before a few of us found a cave. Actually, it was a mine, I guess. I should say that because there's a difference. There's something like 100,000 abandoned mines in the state of Arizona. I learned about that after this all happened. But I know that the other 99,999 aren't like the one we found. 6 of us spotted the cave, a small hole on the top of a hill, framed like a square by a couple of 2x4s wedged into the earth, barely wide enough for a body. Jim never entered. He got the creeps right from the start. The way he stood looking in that hole, shivering and dancing like there were worms in his shirt. The rest of us had a good laugh. Clint never entered either, on account of being too big for the hole. Lucky for the rest of us. That meant nobody had to argue over who was going to be the lookout. Between Jim and Clint's 4 eyes, we'd know if somebody was coming who would rat us out. I guess in that way, we knew we were doing something wrong. We had that kind of anxious excitement pumping in our veins, knowing that we might get caught doing something we weren't supposed to. The hole was new, though. It was something we'd never seen and therefore something we'd never done. So we climbed on in to check it out. It must have been a 30-foot drop. We spread our hands and legs to keep from falling, digging our feet and fingernails into the wet earth around us. It was hot and humid down there, practically a sauna. We joked that if Clint had come, he'd be as thin as the rest of us by the time we reached the bottom. Clint didn't laugh, but I don't think he heard us. Eventually, we slopped out to the bottom. We fell and whined and rubbed the sore spots on our bodies. It was weird down there. Somehow crawling down that tunnel felt like being born again. It was like we'd left our lives in Arizona behind and returned down there in the dark to the arms of Mother Earth. All 4 of us were in awe. Then we realized we didn't have a light. We climbed back up, which was much harder than going down, and we all agreed to come back tomorrow with a rope and a flashlight. I never asked the rest of the kids if they dreamed about the cave, but I know that I did. I dreamed about standing in that darkness. Strangely, it felt like home. The next day, Clint didn't show. I think he was jealous of the adventure the rest of us was having. Jim stuck around, though, happy just to be included. Maybe he felt it tugging on him too. The second trip wasn't particularly exciting. We landed in the tunnel, or mine shaft, whatever, and we whipped out our flashlight and checked out the walls. They were wet, which was no surprise. One of the other boys said something about what if we ran into an underground lake and drowned down there where no one could find us. There was a pang of fear in us all, I'm sure, but something about the mine kept pulling us. On the third trip into the cave, we heard them, chattering in the distance, in the direction we were headed. The walls weren't enough to keep us fixated anymore, and we all knew that the cave wanted us to travel deeper. We heard something like squirrels, chattering, skittering. It sounded like little claws scraping in the dirt and stone. That was as far as we went that time before heading out again. Then the weekend came, and we all had to spend time with our folks. Saturday there was a cookout, Sunday was church. Then we returned to the cave on Monday, after dreaming about it all weekend. The fourth time into the cave is when we actually saw the creatures. A flash of white, low to the ground, crossing the beam of our flashlight so quickly that it might have been a bolt of lightning. The thing had glistening, pasty white flesh. We all got out of there immediately. The fifth time, I went down alone. The others were convinced that we'd seen a sick animal or one of those lost species that always turned up on the sci-fi shows. I didn't care what it was. I just wanted to be in that cave, and I was sure that the cave wanted me in there too. At the end of the line, that tunnel we were following opened up to a big chamber. I don't know what it was used for when the mine was still open, but I know that on that day, it was the source of an infestation. There must have been 100 of them. Short, wiry little men with ghost-white skin and chattering, ravenous mouths. If they had eyes or noses, they were too small for me to see. They didn't see my light. They didn't see me. But the cave must have somehow revealed my presence because all at once, they stopped in their tracks and turned to face me. They stared with their mouths, but they might as well have stared into my soul, might as well have taken a bite with how they left me after that day. I don't remember how I got out that final time. All I know is that the next thing I remember, I was lying in my bed, but I never forgot what happened. Nope, I sure didn't. In fact, I dream of them every night. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the chatter. I can still hear their pointed nails, scratching the walls of the place that strangely felt like home to me. I wonder why it called me there. And I think that's the part of all of this that has me the most scared. A few summers ago, I decided I wanted to get away by myself, somewhere where I'd never been before. I was kind of fed up with people at the time and just wanted some nature and solitude. I found this A-frame cabin rental in Maine that sounded like just what I needed. I'd never been to Maine, but had always wanted to check it out. This place was near the Basin Preserve. It was just gorgeous there, and the temperatures were so perfect, especially for late July. I was coming from the heat of Kansas City, so I was often inside in air conditioning at this time of year. I spent some really peaceful days relaxing and hiking. I even found this great place to pick blueberries. It felt so nice and idyllic, the exact opposite of the hectic city life I had been living. My cabin was in the woods, and it had this really cozy porch that became my favorite place to hang out. I tend to be a real night owl, so one night I was out there on the porch reading with my headlamp. It was around 1 a.m., and I had a book that I just hadn't been able to put down. I heard a loud cracking sound like someone stepping on a big branch. I was really engrossed in my reading, so at first I didn't pay much attention to it. But then I heard it again. I turned my headlamp to high and aimed the light toward the woods. And about 8 feet off the ground, I saw these huge eyes reflecting back at me. They were a bright golden yellow, kind of slanted. They were staring directly at me. I'm not that good at judging distance, but I want to say it was maybe 20 yards away. When I saw those eyes, I was just filled with this intense dread. I was gauging the height of it by comparing where I saw the eyes in relation to the outhouse that was between us and a little to the side. I didn't see anything other than the eyes before I rushed inside. I locked the doors and was running around the house like a crazy person looking to see if there was anything I could use for a weapon. I got the windows closed except for this one that was up high that needed a tool to reach. Through that window screen, I could hear this thing slowly walking toward the cabin with steps that definitely sounded like something walking upright. It sounded like it was slowly walking back and forth in front of the cabin over and over. Then it got quiet, just completely silent. I was too scared to look, but I made myself look anyway. I was peeking through the side of the curtain, but I couldn't see anything at all. Then I heard this hellacious howl. It was like a wolf howl mixed with a human howling in terrible pain. The A-frame had a loft, so I decided I would climb up the ladder and see if I could spot it from the upper window. The backyard of the cabin had this bamboo fencing that was about 6 feet tall. I was looking out the window into the backyard. The back porch light was on, and all of a sudden I see this thing jump over the fence into the backyard. I mean, it easily jumped that fence. It was so huge. It was at least 7 feet tall. It had a huge snout and really sharp canines. It was black, and it had this massive ruff of fur around its neck. It was so beefy looking, like a bodybuilder. I think I would describe the head like a giant wolf head, 3 times the size of a real wolf head. It was pacing back and forth, and then it was out of sight and came closer to the house, and I heard it tapping on the windows. At that point, I was just about dead from fright. I wanted to call someone, the police, anybody, but I didn't have any service. Then I heard that terrifying howling scream again. It came back into sight, and I saw it sniffing the air, and its ears were moving. It went back and stood next to the fence. I was mentally begging it to just leave. I felt so much dread filling my whole body. My hands were sweating and my heart rate was off the charts. Then it just jumped back over the fence. I was listening so intently. I never heard it walk away. No footsteps into the distance or anything. I was praying that it was really gone and not just hiding on the other side of the fence. I tried to come back to my senses and breathe steadily, but I was really messed up. I did not want to stay there, but obviously I wasn't going to risk going outside to my car. I stayed up in the loft the whole night. There was a futon up there that wasn't comfortable at all, not that I could sleep anyway. Early in the morning, I packed up all my stuff and looked out of every window to make sure I didn't see that thing anywhere. Then I made a mad dash to the car and drove away. I had paid for a whole week's stay at the cabin, but there was no way I would ever go back there again. I drove to Phippsburg and checked myself into a hotel. I did contact the owner of the cabin and tried to describe what I experienced. I got so emotional when I was reliving it that I guess he took pity on me and gave me a full refund. Or maybe he just didn't want any bad publicity getting out about his place. Either way, he said he had never heard of that kind of creature in those woods before. He said he would report it to the authorities, but who really knows if he did or not? I'm just glad I got away from there unharmed. I would normally keep this type of encounter to myself, but I've really come to enjoy your show and the way you treat everyone with dignity. I don't look for trouble or drama, you know what I mean? When I got my new truck camper rig set up, I just wanted to get into the woods and soak up the peace and quiet, especially considering all the freaking problems I had to work out to get the whole thing up and running. My first trip was heading out west to the Umpqua National Forest in Oregon to get some relief from this insane heat we've been having. I got to know this guy on the internet who was always talking about these incredible crystals he was finding. They were unbelievable. Stuff you'd see at gem shows for serious money. He was digging them out of the earth. Me and my brother were always rock hounding when we were kids. I love how you can find spectacular things for free if you know where to look. It took me a couple of 10-hour driving days, but my dog Jack and I finally made it to Grants Pass, Oregon, and got a hold of the guy, Patrick, who I found on the internet to help us. He was going to get me set up with a boondocking spot near Myrtle Creek, about an hour up north. We met up at the diner there for a coffee. Patrick looked like some kind of forest sprite with his green eyes and intense stare. He was shy and seemed out of place in town. He told me he knew places in the woods that most people were unaware of because of his hobby of planting baby fir trees. He really got into the thick of things out there. He was driving this beat-up station wagon with the back half of the roof caved in. I followed him out of town until we accessed this creekside dirt road. Then we just kept heading west until we were surrounded by these enormous trees everywhere. I'm telling you, they were enormous, and it was like nothing had ever been there till we arrived. And besides the sound of the river, it was dead silent. You'd think with all those trees you would hear a bird or two. Not one bird sound did I hear. Patrick showed me a spot of level ground where I could park the camper and get settled in. He took a tool roll out of the back of the station wagon and unrolled it on the ground. There were hammers and chisels and safety goggles and headlamps and other things in there. He seemed to know what he was doing. He pulled 2 hooded black vinyl ponchos out of his backpack and whispered that I should put one on. That seemed weird to me. There wasn't any rain, but he whispered that it would keep us more concealed. I didn't understand, but I didn't argue. It was so shadowy and quiet, I already felt concealed from everything. But something about that place wouldn't even let you speak out loud. He was going to take me to one of his favorite spots upstream in exchange for me helping him list and sell his findings. I got Jack leashed up and ready to go, and then Patrick said it wasn't safe to bring the dog. Not safe? What did that mean? It was strange, but it was like Patrick was someone you didn't question. Like, why are we wearing ponchos? Why can't the dog come? Why is your car bashed in? I staked Jack out on his leash and we headed into the brush beside the river. Once you got in there, you could see a faint path. It was evening and I was kind of hungry and feeling grungy and sticky from sweating through my last 2 days of driving. But I knew Patrick had limited time, and this was really a rare opportunity to have such an experienced guide. The stream was really rushing along, but then we came to this spot where it widened out and partially flowed into a shallow cave. Patrick pointed at the cave like that's where we were supposed to go. We put on the headlamps and headed into the cave. It stank. It smelled like an unwashed human had been living there for weeks, but obviously we were off the beaten path of indigent camps. When Patrick started digging at the water's edge, right away he started uncovering these gorgeous crystals. I was stunned. How could something like that be so close to the surface? I dug in and felt like I was in a dream with these perfect specimens I was unearthing. The beauty and the odor really did not go together. I was immersed in my search. It was so dark and quiet. Then crash! Into the mouth of the cave burst Jack. He was yelping and howling and tearing at my poncho like he was possessed. He looked like a cat with his hair all standing on end. He dragged and dragged at me, pulling me toward the cave's opening, and then I heard the most unearthly whooping sound, and the stench became truly unbearable. Rocks started raining down at the opening of the cave. Jack was wild-eyed. All I could do was succumb to his pulling me outside. It was chaos everywhere, rocks and water and mud and howling, and suddenly my vision was filled by a brown, hairy mass of 10-foot-tall humanoid creature. It howled and swiped at me, and I ran. I just followed Jack blindly out of that hell pit and didn't stop until I got us both into the truck and locked the doors. Patrick followed shortly and slammed himself into his car and took off. I was stunned. Barreling out of those woods, I was unable to make sense of anything. My 30-pound dog had ripped his stake out of the ground to come find me and save me from what? Later on, I was reading about Bigfoot sightings in that area and wishing I had known that sooner. Some people even said they had used pheromones to tempt him out of hiding. I'm sure I was emitting some pretty ripe emanations that day after my lack of showering. But holy cow, I have no words. I'm not looking for trouble. When I had this experience, it changed everything about what I thought about the wilderness. I realized I had no real idea of what all existed out there. This took place when I was 13 or 14 years old. I lived in Ohio, and when I was young, my parents would send me out to a camp in the eastern part of the state for 1 week every summer. It was a sleepaway camp with an outdoor adventure theme. It was everything you'd want in a summer camp, with hiking and archery and group games and campfire sing-alongs and all that good stuff. It had group housing that fell into 3 categories. The first category was log cabins, which were reserved for the older kids. The second category was yurts, which were like large tents shaped like a teepee. The third category was tree houses, and that's where I was staying. The treehouse was essentially a single-room structure, situated 10 feet above the forest floor on wooden supports, kind of like stilts. It was like the lower half of a typical room and didn't really have walls, except for a 3-foot barrier that prevented people from falling out. This meant the treehouse was open to the elements, but it did have a slanted wooden roof with overhangs that protected us from rain. Since there was a distance of about a 1/4 mile between each living area, it felt pretty secluded. Our group consisted of a counselor and about 6 kids. I had always had a little insomnia, and on the last night of camp, I was having trouble falling asleep. The moon was really bright, and that was keeping me even more awake. The night was pretty peaceful besides the typical sounds you'd expect to hear in the middle of a forest on a summer night. I was just laying there lost in my thoughts. Eventually, I realized I was hearing a distinct sound that gradually became more distinguishable from the other noises. At first, it just sounded like a faint rustling of leaves, but as the sound grew closer, I could tell that something was moving through the trees. I started listening closer, feeling a little nervous. It was obvious that whatever it was kept moving toward us since the sound was getting progressively louder after a few minutes. It started sounding like the noise was being made by the footsteps of a person's walking pattern rather than an animal, and by then it sounded really close. At that point, I realized it was approaching from the south, which led towards the depths of the Woods Lake region, instead of from the north, where the outhouse kitchen area was located. That definitely made me think that it wasn't a counselor or someone coming to alert us of something. When I realized that, my curiosity changed to fear. I could tell that whatever it was would soon be reaching the clearing surrounding the treehouse. I tried to roll over as quietly as I could so I could sit up and take a look over the railing. When I sat up, I heard a slight rustling sound coming from my left. The other kids were still asleep, but I saw that the counselor who was sleeping with us in the treehouse was awake. Apparently, he had rolled over in his cot to grab my attention when he saw that I was about to get up. He was still lying down, but he held up his hand to signal me to stop as soon as we made eye contact. I did what he told me and laid back down. I was just holding my breath and listening as hard as I could. The footsteps had stopped, which made me even more nervous since I had no idea where the thing was. I was worried that it was somewhere below us in the treehouse's clearing. Then I heard a branch crack and a strange sound that was like flapping. The counselor got out of his cot as quietly as he could, and I couldn't help myself. I followed him. As soon as we looked through the railing, we saw this bizarre creature swoop out of a tree and land on the ground below us. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen or heard of before. It was tall, dark, and winged, with glowing red eyes that shone in the darkness. It was like me and the counselor were just frozen there, and as we were staring down, the creature looked up and locked eyes with me. I don't know how to explain it, but I almost felt as if it had been seeking me out specifically. The creature didn't move, and it was like it was just studying us with this piercing gaze that felt like it went right through us. The silence then was almost deafening, and I was barely breathing, waiting for it to make its next move. And then it spread its wings and took off, soaring up into the high branches and disappearing in the darkness. We were basically just paralyzed with fear and didn't know what to do next. We stayed huddled in the treehouse for the rest of the night. I mean, there was no way we were going to venture anywhere not knowing where that thing had gone, and we didn't want to wake up the others and have a full-blown panic going on. At least it was only a couple hours until sunrise, and when it got light enough and everyone woke up, the counselor just calmly as possible herded us all to where the main camp was and settled us in the dining area. He ordered us to stay put while he went and talked to the camp director. The other kids didn't know what was going on, and I just did not want to talk about it at all. There was such a weird mood in the camp that morning while we waited for our parents to pick us up. It was a complete contrast to the usual last day shenanigans that would usually be going on. I don't know what the counselors told the parents. I did tell my mom and dad what I had seen. It's hard to know what they really thought. From that day on, I never looked at the woods in the same way again. I had experienced something that hardly anyone would believe, and it really changed me. Hey, if any of your listeners are from Maine or are familiar with Maine, then they might be interested in this. Over the summer, I was canoeing on the Saco River by myself, just to get away for a few days. Sometimes you've just got to not hear other people's voices. You know what I mean, I'm sure. Although at the end of this trip, I was wishing I'd brought someone with me, just so I'd have someone to back me up, that it really happened. I did have my dog, Bo, with me, but he's not much good as a witness. It started out pretty pleasant. If you've never been on the Saco, you need to give it a try. There's a lot of sandbars you can just pull your boat up on and pitch a tent. My plan was to find a good spot and stay put there for 2 nights, but I left after the first one. Bo's really good about sticking close to me. He's a black lab. You know, they're in heaven around the water. I had been paddling for about a half hour, but I could tell Bo was itching to swim, so I told him okay. I was good to let the current take me downstream for a bit, just using the paddle to keep myself from turning sideways. Bo would swim to the shore and race around, popping out and checking to see where I was. Then he'd jump back in the river and swim near the boat for a bit, before doing the whole thing all over again. He was happy as a lark, big, goofy dog grin on his face. At one point, I heard him start barking when he was on land. I whistled and called him, clapping my hands to get his attention. It took a few minutes, but he showed up on the shore. He just sat down and looked at me, which was unusual. I mean, him not swimming out to me. So I thought maybe he's tired, and I paddled into shore. I got out myself to go relieve myself in the woods. But the minute I started to head away from the bank, Bo got all anxious, running around me and barking. I couldn't tell what was going on with him, but he was mighty jumpy. I had to wonder if maybe he'd seen a snake or something. Sometimes a big enough snake will get him acting wild. I just walked over to the nearest tree and did my thing, telling him to calm down. When I started to walk back to the boat, I saw something a little strange on the sand. There were a half-dozen dead fish laying there, with only the bellies eaten out. Kind of strange because just about any animal I know would eat the head too, even if they left the tail. But these all just had half-moon-shaped bites taken out of them, so I was a little puzzled by that. There weren't too many flies on them yet, so it must have happened fairly recently. After a minute, I just put it out of my head, getting Bo all settled in the boat and shoving off. He seemed content to be just a passenger at this point, sitting in the bow and keeping an eagle-eyed watch on the right-hand bank. We found a good sandbar not long after that, and I was ready to be off the river. I beached the boat and tied it, and Bo jumped out, sniffling around while I unloaded my gear. He was sticking pretty close to me, even though I told him, "Go on, it's okay." Usually when I tell him that he's like a little kid at recess, just runs off to explore, but he hung out with me while I pitched the tent. It was pretty darn relaxing, not having anyone around, just me and the river and my dog. That evening, I was kicked back by the fire when Bo started acting weird again. He'd ambled over to the riverbank and was standing with his tail tucked down, just whining. I called him a few times, but he wouldn't come, so I finally walked over there to see what was up. I couldn't see a darn thing, staring out at the river in the dark. But then I heard some splashing, and it sounded big, not like a fish. That had me wondering if there was a bear nearby. They're pretty good swimmers, you know. I already had my food hung in a tree, but I made Bo come back with me to the fire just in case. He was acting really nervous, and within a few minutes he went to the tent door and just stood there whining. I've got a 2-room tent, and I always have Bo sleeping in there with me. I wondered if maybe he wasn't feeling well and wanted to go in early. It's usually the other way around. We get in for the night, and he whines to go back out. I was pretty beat, so I didn't stay up much longer. Bo had laid down right in front of the tent, and he was happy when I joined him. We got inside and settled in, and I fell asleep straight away. I woke up with the light shining in and Bo barking his head off. He looked at me when I sat up, and then he whined, so I unzipped the tent, thinking he had to pee. While I was still getting dressed, I heard a big splash, and Bo yelped. Frantic, I stumbled outside without my shoes because he sounded hurt, and he was. He loped over to me, and he had a big scrape down his foreleg that was bleeding. I looked around but couldn't see any threat, so I ducked back into the tent and grabbed my first aid kit and a bandana. Poor baby was trembling all over while I cleaned and dressed his wound, wrapping the bandana over a gauze pad. It didn't look too bad, but I wondered what it could have been. It looked like he'd been clawed, not bitten. Maybe a raccoon, I thought. I went back over to the river and looked out, but I didn't see anything. Still, with my boy getting scraped up, I felt like we better pack it in. He stayed right by my side while I tore down the tent and packed the boat back up, a sure sign he was feeling bad. As I got into the boat with Bo riding in front, I thought I saw something move just beneath the surface of the water, about 15 feet out, just the way the surface rippled. Strange, but I thought I'd imagined it, so I shoved off. No sooner had I started paddling than I felt the boat bump into something. A log, I thought. But then suddenly we were violently wrenched sideways, almost like something had grabbed us. I turned to look, and there was this thing. I don't even know what it was. It was like something out of a B movie, only part of its head was above the water, less than 10 feet from us. The head was as big as a man's head, but reptilian-looking, all bumpy with scales. It had these big bug eyes, completely black, and it was submerged up to there. I couldn't see the rest of it, but I didn't need to. It was scary as hell. Bo started whining and growling, but kind of hunkered down like he didn't want to be seen, and I had to think maybe this thing was what he'd gotten into a scuffle with. I'll tell you plain, I was scared to death, so I just started paddling hard, getting away from it, wondering how fast the thing could swim. It stayed right where it was, though, thank God, and never came after us. I don't know what the hell that was. I've never even heard of any creature like this. It made me question my sanity. At one point, I had to wonder if it was someone in a rubber mask, but there was no one around. No boats that morning at all. It would ease my mind a little if someone else had seen or heard of this creature, so please speak up if you have. By the way, Bo's fine. His cut healed up with no problem, but we're definitely going to find another river. At the time of this encounter, I was a park ranger at a state park in Arkansas. The place was just gorgeous. Arkansas is known as the natural state since there's so much scenic beauty there. One of the main attractions are the waterfalls. Arkansas has about 300, and some of the best ones tend to be in more remote and mountainous areas. Part of my job was to maintain the access points to these falls in order to minimize risks for people coming to visit them. A lot of my days started really early. I would get on the trails first thing in the morning to check if there were any hindrances. Things happen like flooded creeks, quick mud, dangerous wildlife, etc. The rainy season is approximately October through May. The best time to see the waterfalls is in the rainy season since a lot of the falls go down to a trickle in the summer. So, I was out there in a lot of wet weather. The job isn't for everyone. It involved a lot of isolation and rugged terrain. I was pretty much always wearing my steel-toed wading boots and carrying climbing tools and ropes and stuff. I enjoyed the isolation, though. I've always been an introvert and never was hesitant to get out there alone. One morning, I was headed to a pretty remote area that had been impacted by flooding and long-time water erosion. I needed to assess the damage. It had been closed to the public, and we wanted to make it accessible again. I got up before sunrise and drove out. When I got there, the road went from gravel to dirt, which is common in backwoods Arkansas. Eventually, the road became no longer recognizable because of some past mudslides and rock slides. I had to park my truck and head into the blocked area on foot. There was quite a bit of destruction on the old road, and I had to bushwhack my way through a lot of spots. I eventually came upon the creek, so I knew I was on the right path. I hadn't ever actually been to this waterfall before, and I was relying on GPS, so I was glad to see the creek. I had to wade through the flooded creek for a couple of miles or so. I was really surprised when I suddenly came across an old, abandoned-looking vehicle next to the creek. It didn't have any license plates on it. The car was pretty beaten up. As I got closer, I saw a lot of scratches on the metal and a smashed window on one side. The window that was shattered had some type of cloth on it, and there were dark splotches all over the interior. I didn't really want to know what those were from. Maybe fungus or blood. Next to the car looked like someone had made a campsite of some sort. There were some old cans and what looked like remnants of a campfire. There were large rocks around it resembling seats. I noticed that the rocks had a layer of dirt on top of them that had formed a topsoil of sorts. That meant that the rocks had not been sat on in a long time. I wasn't even sure how long the road to this place had been closed. As far as I knew, it had never been open since I'd been hired for that area. It seemed that whatever had happened there had been quite a while ago. But that still doesn't ease your mind when you're in a pretty remote area all alone, no matter how much you don't mind isolation. I kept going with my bushwhack machete unsheathed and my flare gun at hand. At that point, I was out of the creek and back up on the dirt road. I hadn't gone much further when I was assaulted by this horrendous smell like blood and rotten meat. It was what I imagined a slaughterhouse would smell like. It just came out of nowhere. I started to feel a creepy presence, and I slowed my walking way down and started scanning the landscape. When I looked out past the creek, I saw a gigantic animal. It was crouched over a big deer carcass. My first thought was that it was a gargantuan wolf. But I know there aren't any wolves in Arkansas, and this thing was bigger than any wolf could be. It looked like a werewolf. It was bent over the carcass, eating. It had very long legs with very little fur on them. There was a huge mane around its neck, and the tail was really puffy. The head was unnaturally large, and the forearms were incredibly muscular. Seriously, if you try to bring up an image of a werewolf, that's the closest I can describe it. By some miracle, it didn't seem to know I was there. I held my breath and backed away so slowly, I felt like I was barely moving. It took what seemed like 1,000 years before I felt I was far enough away to turn around and make the long trek back to my truck. The whole way, I was gripped by a fear more intense than I had ever felt. I had all these wild thoughts going through my mind. Like, was that thing connected to the owner of that car? I didn't even want to imagine what might have happened. I notified the authorities about my finding of the car and sighting of the creature. I'm really not sure what measures they took to track it down, but that trail continues to be marked as off-limits to this day, as far as I know. I've told a few people about what I saw, but honestly, what are they supposed to think? None of them has ever come across such a thing. That's why I like to turn on your channel and reassure myself I'm not alone. Every summer, I go to a new place and spend time away from everybody. It helps me get my bearings before I get too overwhelmed by the constant pressures of everyday life. Since I started teaching years ago, I've realized you have to grab time for yourself wherever you can. I try to treat myself to a hike after school when I can, too. The kids are great, and I wouldn't have it any other way, but they're relentless. The drama of 30 kids stuck in a classroom is hard to imagine if you haven't been there. When the school year ends, I'm so wrung out that I go home and can't move for quite a while. I usually let myself be a total sloth and hope I come out of it soon. And I have to, obviously. There's no choice but to use the downtime during the summer to work on everything that's fallen apart at the house. There's no time to deal with it during the school year. It takes me a month to feel like I've put things in order enough to look around a bit. That means it's usually the beginning of August before I start planning a trip. This time I wanted to see the Redwoods. I had been around them a bit when I was a teenager, and I'd always meant to go back. I wanted to camp right in the middle of them. This was when the internet was just getting going, so it was a lot harder to plan your trip details. But eventually I'd found a spot that I liked, Jedediah Smith State Park. It's close to the California-Oregon border. There was no Google Maps in those days, but I figured there was probably something better than my paper maps. So I got on my computer, and I think I got on MapQuest or something. I plugged in the starting point and the destination, and I got these line-by-line written instructions. It was a lot. I printed it out and had several pages of directions. I didn't even read through them before heading out. I just trusted the printout as being correct. I guess I figured the map robots must know what they're talking about. By then, it was around my birthday, August 5th, so I had 2 weeks to get out and back and be ready for school. I got my camping gear thrown together and tossed it all in my Jeep. It was a pretty unorganized trip since I'd left it so late. But I was glad to get out of there and on the road. I took my pages of unread directions and headed out. Everything was going fine until I got to Winnemucca. I was traveling on the usual highways, very straightforward. I stopped at some random cafe and got something to eat. I took it outside to eat in my Jeep and started looking over my directions. I had reached some kind of crossroads, and the instructions had me leaving the main highway and getting on an old state highway. I trusted the robot gods and got back behind the wheel, figuring they knew a better way. Eventually, it was close to midnight and pitch black since the street lamps had disappeared. Still okay, but then I was randomly instructed to turn onto a dirt road. I started questioning my sanity then, because this road didn't seem like it led anywhere people would want to go. I was obviously, naively believing these instructions, and kept going. After about 20 miles of dusty bumping along, all this strange wildlife started to appear. These big birds kept swooping in front of my car. They were beige-colored. Yes, I said beige birds. And they looked about a foot long. Meanwhile, I thought birds slept at night. Then all these giant jackrabbits started appearing. There were dozens of them, so tall and jumping in front of my car. I had to keep slamming on the brakes. They didn't seem to have any regard for vehicles at all. I think I even hit one of them, but there was no way I was stopping. I had to go pretty slow because of the potholes. Eventually, I came to a spot with such a deep hole that I couldn't drive through it, so I turned into the field to go around, and out of nowhere, something descended out of the sky with a blinding blue light and hovered about 100 feet in the air. I stopped in my tracks and realized that it was totally silent. My high beams were on, and in front of me were these huge boulders laid in a circle, a real variety of them, and in the middle of the circle, more boulders laid in an X. My first thought was that it looked like X marks the spot. The blue light seemed like a searchlight shining around, but it eventually stopped when it landed on the X. And then I watched while out of each boulder rose a pale, wispy form that each got drawn up into the light toward the aircraft. I really don't know what to call it other than an aircraft. It was triangular shaped. After that, what I had previously thought were boulders were gone, and the blue light disappeared. Oh yeah, and during this entire encounter, everything had been completely silent. As soon as the craft was gone, I hightailed it out of there as best I could. I really want to know if anyone else has reported encountering something like that. I still can't wrap my mind around it. And apparently, I've since come to learn that in those days, MapQuest always gave you the shortest route possible. As the crow flies, so they say. Needless to say, I never follow directions like that anymore. Hi, Lilith. I've been listening to your channel for a while now. Something that fascinates me every time I hear your stories is that, in every one I've listened to, the supernatural encounters all seem completely random. But here I am, writing to tell you about my personal brush with the supernatural. and it wasn't at all random. I guess you could call me a researcher, but I doubt any academic institution will claim me, even if I do have some fancy initials to put behind my name. My official title is wildlife biologist. I work for the Bureau of Land Management in the Fish and Wildlife Division, but what I really am, and have been for over 20 years, is a monster hunter. 20 years is a long time, right? But that was how long it took until I had the encounter I'm about to tell you about. I'd been on my most recent hike in a remote park in Washington state. Did I mention that I spend most of my time away from civilization, following rumors of what was reported to be a weird bear? Given the area and territory we were working with, it wouldn't have been unusual for any sightings of a large, shaggy animal to be an actual bear. However, I had my doubts. The average brown bear or black bear is a very intelligent, large animal which is fixated on getting food, holding or gaining territory, or mating. It isn't shy of approaching areas that may have food or things they recognize as carrying food, and it will generally spook when confronted with things like bear horns or bear spray. Whatever this animal was, all the reports said that it was typically seen at the edges of the forest. It notably did not run away when hikers made noise. It also didn't move forward aggressively. But what really cinched the deal for me was the note in the report that the several hikers had smelled something odd, something like musty urine and old blood. According to the park ranger who took the report, the hikers had been horrified. Me? I was absolutely thrilled. Breaks like this were exactly what I was looking for. Given the area, I theorized that the animal they were spotting was a Sasquatch. There have been reported Bigfoot sightings in this area for decades, but no conclusive proof has ever been found. That's why I was there, for proof, or preferably, a specimen. I'd already spent several days scouting all the areas where sighting had been reported. While I never got a glimpse of what I was hunting, I did see enough evidence that I felt sure I was right. I'd found several impressions of large five-toed feet, torn bark on trees, and gleefully collected a few very smelly samples of hair, which I thought were promising. I set up trail cams at what looked like the most frequented spots and retreated to my base camp. Ordinarily, I'd work with another researcher, or at least have someone else to man the camera feeds while I handled the legwork. But when your department's budget depends on a politician's mood, you tend to lose your support staff. That made me the only occupant in a single large tent that was mostly full of surveillance equipment, work tables, and notes. The clearing I was camped in was clear enough that I could get a signal from all of my cameras, and I was the only human being for miles. I was secure in my tent and loaded with enough tranquilizer to knock a bull elephant on its butt before night fell. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I was also very aware that trouble happens when you least expect it, and I wasn't willing to trust my safety to the reports that the creature in the area never approached humans. I double-checked the camera feeds to make sure I was getting a clear picture and settled in for a long night. I said in the beginning of my letter that I'd been doing this for 20 years, 20 years of near sightings, finding only tangential evidence, nothing that ever really panned out. In most circles, my lack of serious results would have been cause to be fired. Fortunately, I worked for the government. I don't think I need to tell you how hard it is to be fired from a government job like this. My superiors were patient. They could afford to be. As long as they got what they wanted eventually, everything would work out. I have no problem telling you that I was hoping things would work out tonight. I might not be too worried about my job, but my professional pride would have liked to chalk up a win for once. If you've never been camping in deep woods, you don't have any idea of how dark it gets once night falls. Full moons can be bright, but the moon wasn't full that night. The only light I had was when I was watching my camera feeds from under a blind. For a long time, I got nothing but the expected nocturnal traffic. Deer, opossum, mice, nothing exciting. Until about 3 a.m. At 3:07 a.m., something large walked past camera 4, close enough that all I could see was a big, dark blur. I immediately froze the image and enhanced it. With a little work, I could make out that the blur was a large clump of coarse hair. It was thick and scraggly, more like hanging moss than fur. I couldn't make out color in the night vision mode, but it was dark. I started to get hopeful. Then the camera was knocked over. It's a known fact among cryptid researchers that Sasquatches seem to have the ability to recognize the electrical fields put out by cameras, and they don't like them. So, when my camera was knocked over so that it was facing down, I wasn't concerned. But it wasn't just that camera. One by one, no matter where I had placed the trail cams, they were knocked over or taken offline. This was unexpected behavior. I wondered how the specimen could have found all of the cameras. Was there more than one? Could I have been lucky enough to find a family group? After the 8th camera went down, I wondered if the specimen was actively looking for them. That would have indicated an ability to handle sophisticated thought. I was fascinated. When the 11th camera went down and it was a camera in a more remote area, another thought occurred. If it was actively looking for the cameras, was it also looking for me? Could it track me to my camp? I'm sure you understand when I say it wasn't a comforting thought. But what could I do? Packing up and leaving when I was so close? That wasn't going to happen. I tried to keep busy making what notes I could. It was hard to concentrate when I kept thinking about how something could be hunting me instead of the other way around. The nighttime sounds around me stopped like someone had cut off the soundtrack to the whole forest. Dead silence. That was when I heard it. Something was moving out in the dark at the perimeter of the clearing. It was slow, and it wasn't small, not according to what I was hearing. I half expected the animal to stay where the tree line hit the open clearing. It didn't. Those slow footsteps sounded like they were approaching my tent. I stayed very, very still. I knew I had a tranquilizer, but tranks take time to work, and until the medicine kicked in, I'd be vulnerable. I mean, here I was, about to meet something I'd spent 20 years chasing, and all I could think about was how alone I was. The creature, and I assumed it was a Sasquatch, circled the tent, always moving very slowly. He was probably at least 15 feet away, being cautious. Half of my mind took notes on behavior. The other half was getting, what's the term? Freaked out? It's not scientific, but it's accurate, so I'll use it. I was getting freaked out. There was a large animal, potentially a cryptid I'd spent my life trying to find, circling my tent. All I could hear was that slow pacing, but it seemed to be coming in closer to the tent with every rotation. Was it trying to find the source of the electronic signals? My equipment was covered to prevent light pollution, but it was still active. Something hit the side of the tent. I jumped. I'm not ashamed to say my heart tried to climb up my throat. It took me a few seconds to calm down and realize that it was a thing, not a body. From the size and sound, it was probably a rock. I waited for the specimen to come in next, but all it did was more of that slow circling. By now, it was close enough to hear breathing, heavy, almost wet sounding. I could smell that awful body odor and urine smell that every researcher and monster hunter swears is the calling card of Bigfoot. But there was something else too. Musty blood. The creature stopped pacing on the left side of the tent. I held my breath. There was a slow dragging sound, and then a ripping tear and something pointed and shiny slowly poked through the military-grade canvas of the tent wall. I can't remember what I was feeling. Excitement? Terror? Both? I do remember wishing I could grab a camera to record this moment. I made sure the trank was ready. All of a sudden, something crashed into the side of the tent where I had most of the electronics stationed. It was big enough and heavy enough to easily collapse that side of the tent. Not wanting to be tangled in yards of canvas with an angry creature, I tore open the entrance flap and got out. I still had my mag light on me, and I did what you've seen in every action movie. Put the flashlight way out in front of me. That's exactly what I did, and I aimed at the right side of the tent, where the creature was struggling to untangle itself. It was tangled in the tent side, but I could see it was big. I backed up a few steps and fired. The second the dart went in, The creature snarled and tore its way out of the tent. I finally got a good look at what I'd been chasing all these years. It was not a Sasquatch. It was tall, with broad shoulders, and while it stood on two legs, that's where any resemblance to humans left. The face, if I can call it a face, looked like a wolf or a dog more than any other animal. It was powerfully built, with a thick mane around its shoulders. I've seen bodybuilders with less muscle in their arms than this thing. It snarled into the beam of the flashlight, and I thought, oh, I may have made a mistake. It took a step toward me, and then another. I heard plastic snapping under its weight. It must have stepped on some of my equipment, and it snarled. It was a long, low sound that made every primitive nerve in me stand to attention. I was sure it was going to charge me. I had the stupid thought that, well, at least someone else can use my research notes. That must have been when the tranquilizer started working, because it wobbled on its feet. It shook its head like it was trying to wake up, then dropped to all fours and took off toward the tree line again. My hands were shaking so badly from adrenaline that I couldn't reload fast enough. I think I managed to squeeze off one more, but I don't know if it hit. All I know is that the creature, whatever it was out of sight. I'm sure you're wondering what happened after that, how I explained the destruction of my equipment to both the rangers and my superiors, whether or not I hit with that second shot, and whether or not I caught up to the creature, whether the government now has its hands on a legitimate cryptid specimen. All I can say is that I'm now retired from field work, although I do still have a comfortable desk job and leave it up to you and your listeners to decide. Hi, Lilith. I'm a fan and frequent listener of yours. I especially like when the stories are about unexplained occurrences and creatures in the woods. I think if anyone spends enough time outdoors, they'll eventually come across some strange things they can't explain. Whenever I sat around a campfire with my uncles as a kid, they'd tell me scary stories about things they saw in the forest. Well, now I have a story of my own to share. Almost everyone in my family owns property on the outskirts of the Finger Lakes National Forest. My backyard juts up against it. The forest sits on a ridge called the Backbone between Lake Seneca and Lake Cayuga. My family has been hunting and trapping the area for 5 or 6 generations. We joke that the forest is our ancestral lands because we have been here for so long. In the early spring, I hike up to the peak of the Backbone and set beaver traps along the streams that flow down into the lakes. My family used to make most of its money on beaver pelts at the turn of the century. Now it's just a hobby for us that's been passed down for generations. I'm actually an accountant by day. I joke that my great-great-grandparents are horrified that I don't work on the land, but I do check my traps early every morning before I head into work. On days that I work from home, I'll sometimes check them again before sunset. Last season, I was walking my trap line before work when I saw some disturbing things. The traps that were triggered all had mostly eaten beaver carcasses in them. Blood, bone, and shredded beaver meat littered the rocks and weeds around the traps. It was a grisly scene, but nothing so far from the ordinary that I should be spooked. Predators getting to your trap line is a regular problem. What did startle me about the situation was the scent left behind and the damage to the traps themselves. My traps are heat-treated steel, built for heavy use, but they still had massive gashes and dents in them. No animal, not even a bear, has enough power in its jaws to crumple steel like that. The traps had an oily coating on them that smelled like rancid meat. At first, I thought it was the beaver carcasses, but the kills were too fresh to smell already. Whatever creature had ransacked my line left behind a distinct smell of musty, rotten meat. I talked to my uncles about the incident, and one of them reported a similar situation, ransacked traps and the smell of rancid meat. His trap line was not far from mine, so it was an easy jump to assume the same animal that destroyed my trap line did the same thing to his. This happened twice more, and we began to joke that a zombie bear was roaming the hills. We laughed about it, but I was starting to get spooked, and I could tell my uncles were too. We decided we needed to figure out what was going on. So we bought a bunch of trail cams and placed them around our traps. They were simple motion-activated cameras that would snap a picture if anything moved inside their field of vision. For a few weeks, we didn't see anything. It wasn't even beaver season anymore, but we kept throwing out traps anyway. I'm not advocating poaching, but we really wanted to find out what that thing was. Finally, one of our cameras caught something. I knew we had something before I even looked at the camera when I saw the ransacked trap. The familiar smell of rotting meat was present, and I found patches of hairy skin hanging from low branches and bushes. It looked like the creature's skin was molting off, like in those nature documentaries when the snakes shed out of their skin. I took the SD card out of the camera and nearly ran the whole way back to my car and sped home to see what was on it. The pictures weren't the best quality, but you could clearly make out a dog-like or wolf-like head with eyes glowing in the moonlight. But there was something wrong with the way it was built. It wasn't just that it was way too big to be a dog or coyote. It had a huge humped back and broad, human-like shoulders. The camera was black and white, so I couldn't tell what color the creature was, but the picture was clear enough to see that the thick fur around its head and neck thinned out around the body to show light-colored, maybe gray, skin underneath. There isn't much else I could tell from the first picture, but a succession of photos taken as the creature moved showed that it could even stand on its hind legs. I thought we had solid proof of a wolf-human hybrid. I sent the pictures to the Fish and Game Commission, the National Forestry Service, and some local news outlets. Nobody took it seriously. The local news was the only one to run the story, but they treated it as more of a joke. I'm not even angry about it, to be honest. I'd assume it was just Photoshop too, or something like that if I saw the pictures. A park ranger I knew took a look at the pictures and checked out the site of the traps with me, but he said it was probably a black bear with a bad skin infection, like mange, that was making it look and smell like that. But I've since become an expert on bear anatomy after obsessively trying to figure it out, and no bear is built like the creature I have pictures of. The legs and shoulders are too human-like. Maybe someone who listens to this show can get some answers. I've stopped trying at this point. I used to hike and camp a lot in the woods. I still hunt and trap, but now I never, ever spend the night in the trees. I've heard stories like these, but I never thought it would happen to me, especially since I live in the suburbs. I mean, stuff like this is supposed to happen in isolated areas, right? I guess it can happen anywhere. I don't know. It was late at night. Everyone was asleep besides me, and my dog Ollie. It was a Friday night, and I stayed up to relax from work. I was just watching TV mindlessly, flipping through the channels, nothing really in particular. I ended up staying on some sitcom, I think, until Ollie started acting weird. At first, he just raised his head a few times, looking at the window and the door wall. After a while, though, he started to growl, and then got up pacing. Something was outside, and he wasn't very happy about it. His hair was standing on end, and he wouldn't stop even when I told him to quiet down. I didn't want him to get hurt, so I put him in his crate, and I put my shoes and jacket on. It was November, a week before Thanksgiving, so it was pretty chilly. There was some light snow. I turned one of the outdoor lights on, and I headed outside. I didn't hear anything at first. The wind was starting to pick up, though, and I thought it was just leaves blowing around. Something, though, made me feel weird. I can't really describe it. So I picked up a shovel that was leaning against the house. I had used it a few days before to dig up the flower beds. At first, I thought I was being stupid. "You're in your own backyard, what are you doing?" I said to myself out loud. I looked around the garage, the deck, and along the fence line, and I didn't see anything. It wasn't until I walked back towards the back door that movement caught my eye. Just a shadow at first. I don't know. I look up towards the roof, and start walking backwards a little to get a better look. That's when I see it, trying to hide itself by the chimney and gripping the roof, trying to make itself look as small as possible. It was short, maybe 4 feet or 4.5. It was hard to tell because it was on all fours. Its legs and arms were long and skinny. It seemed to have some sort of nails or claws. It was hard to tell. She were dug in pretty good. It was the face, though. That's what I dream about the most. It was pale, the whole thing really, like a chalky white gray, maybe more gray than white. It was dark out, but this thing was pretty light. Its head seemed big, but maybe that's because its body was so thin. Its eyes were huge, and they kind of glowed with any light they caught, like a dog's or cat's will do. It had slits for a nose, and its mouth was kind of trembling at first, but when it opened to hiss at me, I could see sharp teeth. I think its tongue was pointed. It shot out a little when it hissed. I didn't know what to think or do at first, but when it started moving, I remembered the shovel in my hands. I just held it up at first, but the thing kept moving, so then I started swinging it at the edge of the roof. It moved like a cat, very nimble, and it was pretty fast too. I thought maybe I could reach it if I went on the deck. I run up the deck stairs, and this thing is still in the same spot and is staring right at me. I swing the shovel, and at first it backed up and moved out of the way. But when I swung maybe the 3rd time, it reached out and slapped the blade of the shovel, knocking it back and hissing. I didn't want it to leap down on me, and something screamed in my head telling me how bad that would be. So I recover as best I can, and I now start to jab the blade of the shovel at it. That's when it smacked the shovel again, hard enough that I lost my balance and came crashing to the deck floor. The shovel was too far away to reach now. It had fallen to the deck and bounced away from where I fell. I just closed my eyes and waited for this thing to drop down on me. It never did, though. I opened my eyes back up, got up, and now there was nothing on the roof. It seemed to be gone, but I was careful. I didn't want to chance it. I don't know if my adrenaline was just pumping out of control or what, but I went into the garage and got a ladder. I also grabbed a hatchet, and I put the ladder against the roof and climbed up. I searched the entire roof. I looked at my neighbors' roofs. There was nothing. I woke up my wife in the process, which made her scared and confused, to say the least. I came down, put the ladder and hatchet away, and came inside. I made sure everything was locked up tight, and then told her the story of what had happened. She said she believed me, but I wasn't sure, not until the next day. It was hard to sleep that night. I got maybe 2 hours, if that. I'm not really sure. But I do know that I went back out in the morning and went back up on the roof to look around in the daylight. That's when I saw the marks. There was a group of shingles that had deep gouges in them, like claw marks, near and around the chimney. I pulled them free and brought them back down to show my wife. That seemed to sink into her mind, because the look she gave me, it was something else. I nodded yes to confirm that what she was thinking was true and that I wasn't losing it. I don't know what I saw or what I tried to fight off. I do know that I replaced the shingles, and I've stayed up a few nights listening for signs of its return. Overall, it's hard to sleep now. It hasn't come back, though, and unfortunately, I don't know if it will. So I live in Florida now, but I used to own a campground near Grand Lake, Colorado. Grand Lake's a glacier lake, so it's cold. You can't really swim in it, even in the summer, but tourists come to go on boat rides around it because it's scenic, or they come to hike. So my campground was outside of town on a dirt road. We had 30 RV hookups, 10 campsites for tents, and 11 cabins, also showers, laundry room, and office. I lived in a little apartment above the laundry, and it was great, really. Hired a few people to help out. Townies and a few transient types who'd head down south or to the ski resorts for winter work. But then one day, this guy comes into the office with a photo on his phone. He was staying at the farthest RV spot from the office. I can't remember. but he had some kind of camper trailer, maybe even an old pop-up. He was staying in with his girlfriend. Older guy, 60-ish. I figured he was retired, but I didn't think about it too much. Lots of people come and go, and most don't stay more than a week. This guy had been there a couple days, I think. I'd been working on payroll for the week, worrying as usual about whether I had too many people on staff and how I was going to make it through the winter. From November to April, I catch a few odd jobs in town, like driving one of the county snowplows, but it's never easy. When this guy walked in, I felt a cold breeze. Maybe not a breeze, more like a little freeze in my gut. Made no sense because when he checked in, the dude was friendly enough, talking about the weather, hiking, photography. That was his hobby. I figured he just wanted to complain that the washer ate his quarters, something like that. So I smiled and said hi, and he said, "I got something to show you." He had a laptop computer under his arm, and he put it on the counter, opened it up, and a photo filled the screen. It was dark. I had no idea what I was looking at. "Did you see those red eyes?" he said. I looked closer, and maybe I saw 2 red dots off to the side of the blurry trees. I guess they were, at least. "Maybe," I said. "Wish I could have got a better shot," he said. "That there's a Mothman, I'm sure of it." So he started to tell this story about how he got up early wanting to walk down to the overlook to get a photo of the sunrise. He heard something like huge wings flapping and turned around. Through the trees, he saw this man-shaped thing, only it had huge wings and no face. Like where the face should have been, there was nothing except these red eyes. He grabbed the camera from around his neck and got off a shot at it. Just before it flew off into the sky, he wanted to try for another picture, but the sky was so dark that he knew he wouldn't get anything. "Wish I'd thought to take a video," he said. The sound of those wings would have picked up on the mic for sure. I didn't really believe him. I'd never even heard of Mothman before. I figured he'd just seen a hawk or something. Lots of them out there. The next day, he and his girlfriend took off, and I pretty much forgot about it. A couple of weeks later, though, things got weird. People would come and set up and leave the next day. They never said why. They'd just break their reservations and go. We were losing so much money that I was sure I'd never have enough for winter. Even the employees started quitting. Finally, after a couple weeks of this, I cornered Jimmy, who runs the laundry and shower rooms, cleans, collects the quarters, fills the machines, all that. "They're scared of Mothman," he said. "Oh, come on," I said. "That's crazy." He showed me a picture on his phone, but it just looked like grainy blackness. He told me he wasn't scared because he'd gotten a special hoodoo bag to ward away spirits, so it stayed away from him. The photo, he said, was from Bob, who used to cut the grass at the campground. Bob quit the week before. I wasn't scared of Mothman, but I was scared I'd never make any money off the place again. Then, one couple came with a small tent, and I gave them the farthest campsite, near the pond. On the day they were supposed to leave, Jimmy found all their things still there, but they were gone. We waited a day and they still hadn't returned. We called the county sheriff, and he took the stuff for evidence. No sign of them. Before we let anyone else have that site, I went out and looked at it. The sheriff guys had tromped all over it, but off near the woods, I saw some weird markings in the dirt. They were in a kind of line like tracks, but claw-like, sort of. I looked up what moths' feet look like, and they could have been big moth feet. I don't know. I wasn't really sure. Anyway, I was tired of not knowing what was going on, so one day I got up really early and went to the edge of the campground where it meets the woods and just stood there looking for a while. You know how your eyes take a while to get used to the dark, and when they do, you slowly start to see more? That happened, and then I saw something standing there at the edge of the woods. It was pretty far away, but I saw the red eyes. There was a huge, loud flapping sound, and then the thing was gone. Let's just say that's the moment when I decided to sell the campground and move to Florida, and that's where I am now, sharing this insane encounter with you. I was interning at a small newspaper one summer while I was still finishing up my degree in journalism. The internship I landed was in this tiny town in Vermont, but internships were hard to get, and I needed the experience, so I took it. The first month was horrifically boring. I wrote fluff pieces about apple festivals and parades and charity car washes. I knew that I wouldn't get anything particularly hard-hitting in such a small town, but I was hoping for at least one good story before I left. Unfortunately, it took a tragedy to get that one good story. 2 hikers had gone missing one weekend, while out in a state forest not far from town. Apparently, it did happen from time to time, given that the area was so wild and undeveloped, and many people were completely unprepared for the conditions. Although usually these issues were related to sudden bad weather, this was mid-July. There had been no storms in the last several weeks. The prevailing theory was that they had left the trail and got very lost or had possibly fallen. There were the normal search and rescue attempts from the local organizations, and some volunteer search parties were organized. I was sent out to do a human interest piece on the group that planned and supported the volunteer search efforts. I met them in a parking lot by the trail and interviewed a bunch of people. It was cool to see the process and how hard they worked to pull it all together. I was also hoping to hear some news firsthand. Even though it was way above the call of duty to participate in the search, I joined them on their next sweep. I figured it would add a little something extra to my story. Plus, it didn't feel right to just be standing around while everyone else was working so hard. I tagged along with a group of 4 locals who were heading into the woods. They had a whole coordinate system that I didn't understand, so I just followed along, making notes and keeping an eye out for the hikers. I could see firsthand how hard this was going to be. The park was absolutely massive, and the woods were thick and confusing. There were steep ravines everywhere, so the hikers could easily have tumbled off of one and might never be found. An hour in, we found a clue, and I was ecstatic that I had come along. Our group found a backpack on the ground way off the trail. There wasn't anything identifying in it, but it looked like it hadn't been out there very long, so it was a solid bet that it belonged to the couple. The search leader called it in and got more volunteers to fan the area, since it was likely they would be close to where we found the bag. A little while later, we found 2 hiking poles and started to get worried. We were hoping it wasn't a horrific injury. Rescue wouldn't be able to get to that section for hours, and no one wanted to wait in case someone was still alive but badly hurt. So, we kept going. We searched the area closely, assuming they may not have gotten too far. We did find a few more items like a water bottle, a sweatshirt, and a cell phone and tufts of fur, like they had been in a fight with a wild animal, but no actual people. It was weird. After we completely canvassed that area, we spread out even more. Soon things took a turn for the weird. That's when we saw the prints. Giant footprints, barefoot, huge, and oddly shaped like a human foot. We followed them for a while until they ended abruptly. They just stopped dead in the woods, without explanation. We hushed ourselves into complete silence, solemnly exploring the area, resigned to the fact that something awful had probably happened, and we might not be able to find out exactly what. Just then, we all heard a faint yell. We all started yelling back, and after searching a few minutes, we located the missing hikers. To everyone's surprise, they were curled up in a tree, clutching a thick tree branch, looking terrified. They were both traumatized and looked dehydrated. As we waited for rescue, some of the volunteers tried to talk to them to see what had happened. They didn't say much, but the man just kept muttering something. Finally, we asked him to say it slowly and clearly. That's when we heard it. He was saying, "Dog man." It was a dog man, over and over. We thought he was delirious, but then I thought about the weird footprints and the strange fur. But at that point in time, I kept my thoughts to myself. After the police and rescue teams arrived and got the 2 of them down, the man started talking a little more, hysterically describing the half-man, half-dog that they had seen in the woods that had terrified and chased them. He said it was huge and human-shaped, but covered in fur. They had been so terrified that they dropped everything and ran, but they kept feeling the presence of the creature looming behind them, and so decided to climb the tree, hoping it couldn't and wouldn't follow. Luckily, the man described watching the creature stop in its tracks, sniff at the air for a bit, and then spin around and run in the opposite direction. Back at the office, I had a choice to make. It was risky, but I chose to write the entire experience as honestly as I could. I described the scene and what the man had said, word for word. I didn't make any claims, but my story was pretty clear. The paper wouldn't print it and threatened me not to give my written account to anyone, so in the end I put it on Reddit, but changed the location and waited for comments to come in. Turns out lots of other people have had similar experiences and encounters, even if they didn't have to hide in a tree to survive. As for that town in Vermont, the official story was an unnamed animal attack, but I can attest to the fact that there are officials in that town who know the truth. They're just not talking about it. When I was 15, my parents moved us from our Chicago suburb to a tiny town up in northern Minnesota. My father had lost his job when the factory shut down, and he had a cousin who offered him work up there. I was obviously less than thrilled to be changing schools partway through high school, but moving to a freezing northern town made it 1,000,000 times worse. My parents insisted that it was a beautiful area, and that with the lakes nearby there was a ton of outdoor stuff we could do. We moved in June, just after we finished the school year. As it turned out, the summer wasn't awful. It was surprisingly nice and warm, which I hadn't expected. My dad's cousin let us use his boat, and we spent a lot of time out on the lake. Dad took us fishing a few times, and we even started playing hockey, just to fit in. Then in the fall, school started. The new school we went to was ridiculously small compared to my school back in Chicago, but I made some friends pretty quickly, and I decided that I could survive these last 2 years before returning to Chicago for college. Then, winter hit. Winter in Chicago had been tough, so I thought I was prepared. Nope. This was absolute hell. The temperature was regularly in the single digits, if not below zero. Also, we were close enough to the lake that the wind chill dropped it another 20 degrees. I barely left my room most days, except for school or hockey practice. By February, I was going stir-crazy. Then by spring, we started to get warm spells, and out of desperation, my brother and I begged my parents to take us somewhere, anywhere, just to get outside. They ended up suggesting we spend the weekend at a state forest about an hour away. Our parents had bought everyone kayaks for Christmas as a peace offering for the move. The park had tons of lakes and rivers, so we were going to kayak and hike and camp overnight. We got to the park Saturday morning with no problem. We found a campsite, set up, and then lugged our boats to a launch point. We floated around the lake for hours, taking pictures of wildlife, fishing, and just hanging out. When we returned to the campsite, we walked around for a little while, but then made a campfire and had dinner. Despite the abnormally warm day, it was still supposed to get cold overnight, so we had brought extra blankets and lots of them. The paddling had taken a lot out of us, so we all fell asleep right away. In the middle of the night, I woke up needing to go to the bathroom. I ignored it for as long as I could, not wanting to get out of my sleeping bag, but eventually I had no choice. I wrestled my way out, trying not to wake my brother up, and threw on boots and my coat. The tents were in a clearing, but there was a small stand of trees maybe 20 yards away, so I headed there. I definitely wasn't going all the way to the campsite bathrooms. I didn't bring a flashlight because the moon was bright enough that I could basically see where I was going, and I wasn't going far anyway. I stepped a few feet into the trees and took care of business. Just as I was finishing up, I heard a sound. Definitely an animal sound. I wasn't scared, just curious. I was still getting used to seeing wildlife everywhere, and I had a running tally of the things I'd seen in the wild lately. I was hoping it was something cool, like an elk or moose, maybe even a wolf, although that probably would totally scare me. I stayed silent, waiting to see what it was. I heard a few more faint sounds, but couldn't see anything. I was freezing, so I decided to head back to the tent. Just then, I saw something moving between the tree branches. Based on how tall it was sure it was definitely a moose or elk. I thought about trying to wake my family up quietly because I was sure they wouldn't believe me, but I was afraid it would be gone before we could all get back to see it. So, I stood still and kept watching. After a minute, I saw a flash of something moving again and heard it getting closer to me. It came out from between a stand of thick, evergreen trees. At first, I couldn't figure out what I was seeing. I saw the face first and immediately thought wolf, but the head was way too high. Besides, the face was just wrong. And then out came the rest of it, and I saw its body. It was walking on 2 legs. It was tall, at least 8 or 9 feet tall. The body wasn't completely human. The arms were too long and it was slightly hunched. The legs were muscular, and all 4 limbs ended in claws. The whole body was completely covered in fur, dark brown, almost black fur. The creature stared right at me with glowing amber eyes that were far too intelligent. It opened its mouth and let out a weird half pant, half grunt, letting me see its razor-sharp teeth. That was enough to send me running. I screamed the whole way back to our tents and headed for my parents' tent. Of course, by the time they got up, the hideous creature was gone, and of course, they didn't believe me. They insisted that I was either still asleep or had seen shadows playing tricks on me in the woods. But I knew what I saw. Back home, I searched online and eventually found exactly what I was looking for. Some pictures were different, but a few were almost identical to what I had seen that night. They were calling it a dog man. In the spring of 2006, when I was about 12, my dad and I took a road trip to Denver, Colorado to visit my grandma for a few weeks. We were originally going to fly, but my dad figured it would be a cool experience to drive so we could enjoy the sights and sounds along the way and get some fresh air. It would also be good to have our own car there. We lived in northern Nevada, so it was about a 15-hour ride to Denver. We packed the car and headed out on a weekend in early April. The ride was kind of boring at first. I spent most of my time playing my Game Boy Advance while Dad drove. We stopped by local restaurants, took some photos, and even stopped to relax for a bit at some hot sulfur springs. Then, once we got further into Colorado, Dad took one of the more scenic routes. He decided to drive along Peak to Peak Highway, a road that is a few miles north of Denver. The road is about 30 or 40 miles long, something like that. We would check it out and then continue down to Denver after. It was beautiful out there. The trees, the mountain ranges, and the cool air. We had gotten there a little late, and before we knew it, it was already nighttime. The road is in the middle of the mountains and doesn't have any lights. Dad had to rely solely on our headlights to see where we were going. It got pretty dark out there, and we couldn't drive very fast. And there weren't really any other cars out this late on the highway. There were 2 or 3 we passed when it was light out, but once it got dark, we maybe saw one. My dad was pretty tired from the drive, and we didn't have any signal on the radio, so he asked me to talk to him to keep him awake. I started asking him a bunch of random questions about Grandma and what it was like growing up. We talked for a bit and were deep in conversation when suddenly I thought I could make out a figure far in the distance, but I wasn't sure. As we got closer, I started to see something becoming more visible. It was standing in the middle of the road with its hand straight out in front of it. I yelled to my dad a bunch of times to stop. I was panicking, and he finally braked. That's when we finally saw it. The creature had huge, hairy hands with long fingernails like claws. It was maybe 8 or 9 feet tall and was standing on 2 legs. It was hairy, but not completely. I could see its muscular gray skin beneath its fur. I couldn't make out the face. Its hand was still up and in the way, but its legs were like a dog's, but the feet were longer, with long nails like its hands. It lowered its hand, and we saw that it had a face like a wolf's, with yellow, piercing eyes. And it was snarling at us. My dad and I were frozen and couldn't get our words out. This thing was just staring us down. Finally, it moved and took a few steps towards us. This snapped Dad out of it. He put the car in reverse, and after he got a bit of distance from it, he turned the car around and sped away in the direction we had come from. I was terrified. I asked Dad over and over what was that, but he just kept telling me to calm down, to relax. But I started to freak out even more. Outside my dad's window, I could see it running right alongside us. We were speeding down the road, but this thing was keeping up with us like it was nothing. I yelled and told Dad that it was right next to us to go faster. He didn't look over and stayed focused on driving, but he told me to grab the roof handle above my seat and to hold on, and slammed the gas pedal to the floor. I closed my eyes and started praying. We just drove and drove for I don't know how long. Then I finally felt the car start to slow down, and Dad told me to open my eyes. We hadn't realized that we had lost the creature, but it was gone. We reached Grandma's in the early morning, but my dad told me not to mention anything about what we had seen. The experience shook both pretty badly. My dad and I would talk about it with each other, reading stories online and trying to figure out what we had seen. We debated if maybe all we saw was a bear, but we both knew that made no sense. The speed this thing ran at, and on two legs, didn't make sense. Dad always reminded me not to mention this story to anyone, afraid that people might think we were both crazy, but I felt like I had to share this story with you. We saw the dog man, and letting you know he exists might help you someday too. It was the end of summer in 2009, and my mom and I were taking a last-minute weekend trip to see my grandparents before school started. My grandparents lived out in the middle of nowhere, or so I called it. I was a teenager at the time, and being out in the woods wasn't really my thing. There was nothing to do but sit around the kitchen talking with my mom and grandma, or hanging out with my grandfather in his woodworking shop. He loved to tinker around, making all sorts of wooden things. Anything from bowls on his lathe to tables and chairs that he sometimes sold at local swap meets. When we arrived at their house, Mom headed inside, and I went straight to the wood shop to look for my pap. Sure enough, I found him in there working on something I had never seen him make before. He was leaning forward, carving a bust out of a piece of wood, but it didn't look like a human head. He was carving some kind of animal, something with long fur all over its head. I watched him for a while and finally asked what he was making. He looked me straight in the eyes and asked if I had ever heard of a dog man. I slowly shook my head, no, and wondered for a minute what he was talking about. It sounded like some sort of mythical creature to me. Like, was it a dog or was it a man? He sat the piece of wood down and asked me to come sit next to him. He said he had something to tell me, now that I was old enough to handle it. The story he was about to tell me had happened 25 years prior, in 1984, way before I was born, but he still thinks about it every day. The day that he saw a creature that he's convinced lives somewhere in the woods near their house, but he can't prove it. It was October of 1984, and he was working on building the wood shop back then. He was doing it all on his own by cutting his own timber and planing it himself. Back then, he was still working his job and had to do a lot of the building at night. During the summer, this was fine since the sun set late, but in the fall, the days were starting to get shorter. One evening, he had worked a little longer than usual, forgetting how soon the sun was now setting. It was already dark by the time he started cleaning up his tools and bringing them all inside for the night. As he was putting them all away, he realized that he couldn't find his axe anywhere. He looked all around the work area outside the garage door before realizing that he must have forgotten it out in the woods where he had just cut down a tree. Now you've got to understand my pap. He's super meticulous and would never be able to sleep if it wasn't in its proper spot in his garage. Little did he know that something else was about to happen that would make sleeping difficult for years to come. He grabbed a flashlight and wandered off into the woods to find the axe. He knew those woods like the back of his hand and wasn't nervous at all, but said that something didn't feel right that night. He had a weird feeling like he wasn't alone. He retraced his steps back in the direction of the cut tree, but kept hearing a low rumbling noise that made him stop and listen. Each time he stopped, the noise stopped, and when he started again, the noise started again. He described the noise as a low growl or deep breathing noise, a noise that he'd never heard before in his life. Finally, he reached the tree, and sure enough, the axe was stuck in the stump waiting for him to grab it. Happy to have found it, he grabbed it and quickly turned around to get back home before Grandma started worrying about him. He swung the flashlight around and took one step towards home when he came face to face with a creature whose features stunned him and froze him in mid-step. The creature towered above him, blocking his path back to the house. It was completely covered in dark, black fur, but it was thin and muscular, human-like, like a man with the face of a dog and standing on two back legs. The two of them stood there staring at each other, my grandpa frozen in place, and the dog-like creature gazing down with its amber eyes glowing back at him in the light of the flashlight. Grandpa said that all he could think about was the drool dripping from the creature's mouth, and he thought for sure he was a goner. But just as quickly as the encounter happened, the human dog creature leapt off into the woods, letting out a howl that sounded like a human screaming. Grandpa listened to the horrifying howls until they became faint enough that he felt safe to continue on the path back home. When he finally got there, Grandma was a mess, wondering what had happened to him. He told her he had gone off for the axe and had gotten off the path and mixed up in the dark woods. She could see from the look on his face that it was something else, that he hadn't gotten lost. Besides, he knew those woods like the back of his hand. That day in the wood shop, he told me that he never did tell Grandma what he saw, and that I was the first person in 25 years to hear the story. But even still, he thought of that creature every day and never went back into the woods at night and never forgot his tools again. With that, he handed me the carved bust that I could now see was this dog-man creature, and he told me never to forget what lives in the woods. I attended my first music festival a few years ago. It was a small local one, nothing big or crazy like Coachella. There were probably only 2,000 attendees at most. The festival lasted 3 days, and my friends and I were some of the maybe 500 people who camped out overnight. There were 3 small campsites erected in the field not far from the stages, and they were very primitive. Just some designated spots for tents and a few porta potties. The festival happened in a fairly open field, with trees lining the edges of the field. It was intentionally held in an area far out of town to avoid annoying residents with the sounds of music and partying. The first night of camping went fine, although it wasn't very comfortable, or quiet since some people stayed up all night drinking. The second night, my friends and I tried to go to sleep around 3 a.m. There were 4 of us, and 2 tents, so I was sharing with my best friend. Our campground was decently quiet by that point, fortunately, and we hoped for a better night's sleep than the first night. But before we could fall asleep, we heard the screaming. Not the fun, playful kind of screaming, but horror movie screaming. We all scrambled out of our tents trying to see what was going on. The moon was behind the clouds, and the site only had a few mounted lights leading to the bathrooms, so it was very dark. Too dark for us to see what was happening. But we could tell that at the far end of our campground, there was some kind of commotion, a group of crying and screaming girls, and a large crowd of people around them trying to calm them down. We watched for a minute but didn't get closer. It didn't appear to be a real emergency. We were getting ready to get back in our tents when the second round of screaming started. This time it was on the other side of the field. 3 guys came running out of their tents, yelling something we couldn't understand. Something was definitely going on, and I was starting to get a bit worried, but didn't have a clue what it was. After the third round of screaming erupted, we heard someone yell something about a dog, which was even more confusing. Why on earth would people be this freaked out by a dog? And we hadn't seen any dog running around or heard any barking or growling. But the campsite was in chaos by that point. It didn't help that at least half of the campers were drunk or on other party favors, making them easily confused and excitable. Some of them had run out of the field to their cars, but there was one big group huddled together, waving their flashlights around wildly. We wanted to go get the whole story, so we approached the group. We found a sober-looking younger guy and asked him what was going on. He told us that people were seeing some kind of massive feral dog in the campground. It had nearly attacked the girls, and then it had shredded the tent of the group of guys. While he was telling us this, I could hear the one hysterical girl insisting that it wasn't a dog, but I didn't understand what she was trying to say. Was it a dog or not? There was a debate going about calling the police, but it would probably take them a good 20 or 30 minutes to get out here. Other people wanted to run for their cars, but were too scared to run across the open field. We were still highly baffled as to why people were so freaked out. No one had gotten hurt, and there was a discrepancy about what was even out there. I was starting to suspect group hysteria and possibly a poor stray dog in the wrong place at the wrong time. I talked my friends into going back to our tents, since there was no point in standing out in the field all night. We walked back to our site without issue and climbed in our tents once again. My friend and I sat up for a while, waiting to see if there would be more noise before trying to sleep. 10 minutes later, as we sat and talked about the festival, a giant shadow passed really close to our tent and paused in front of it before continuing on. It was tall, so we assumed it was a person, but we decided not to unzip our door to check. A minute later, we heard more screaming, really close this time. Someone tapped on our tent, yelling at us to run. We were really scared at this point and hurried outside. We saw that most of the big group had dispersed, and they were all running in different directions. Not far behind them was something big and dark. I peered into the dark field, trying to figure out what it was. It was running on two legs, like a person, but wasn't really human-shaped. It was thicker, and the head was too big. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it towards the dark shape. I could instantly see what the confusion had been. I felt it too. The head of the thing was a dog's head. Long snout, big fangs, yellow eyes. But the body was more human-like than dog-like. The legs and torso were long and thin. The reason the shape had looked weird to me was the thick, dark fur all over the body. As it got closer and we finally saw it clearly, we started running too. We darted for the parking lot with everyone else. I only turned around once, but I saw it drop to all fours and lope into the woods. We got to our car and drove away, leaving our tents and sleeping bags behind. The festival did resume the next day as normal, but it closed down at midnight and our campsite was roped off. The official story was a coyote attack, despite at least 20-some witnesses saying otherwise. The fact that most witnesses were inebriated lost us all credibility. I saw some internet stories about the festival dogman, so I knew other people had seen what I had seen. It was obvious that we all knew what we had seen, even if no one did believe us.